Thanks, Glenn, and thanks everyone for being here. And I especially want to say it's great to see both Helen and Olive here because they are central to the story that I'll tell today. Now you can see what I'm going to talk about in about half an hour or 15-20 minutes, plus with some additions by both Helen and Olive, I hope. I'll give you a bit of a background about the Port Kembla copper smelter story, and I've called it Power, Politics and the People. Essentially, I'll talk about the story of how the residents of Port Kembla, together with supporters from both within and without the Illawarra, fought the copper smelter, which meant the individuals, the community, taking on industry and the government. Now, you may have already looked at some of the material relevant to this story, because I've seen in the course outline there are a number of references to articles and journals and a number of resources that you may have already seen. So forgive me if you know some of the background and detail that I'll give you today. What I'll do is I'll start with a brief timeline of the life and death of the smelter and then hone in on the 1990s, the late 1990s, when... Hello, Michael. Hello. Two more individuals involved in the copper smelter story. So I'll hone in on the late 1990s, which is the era in which community action was the greatest with respect to the copper smelter. I'll then pull out some of the issues that arise from this story that are most relevant to this subject of politics, the community and the common good. Now, it won't be surprising for you to hear that the main issues that arise are ones about power, how the power of the community can be pitted against other powers in our society and what happens when they clash. So to the timeline. 1908 was when smelting began in Port Kembla, so very early on. Before regulation to do with air quality, before regulation to do with pollution, before regulation that we see as very commonplace that protects the health of the community and the environment of the community. Now, despite concerns about the pollution that was being caused by the industry across Port Kembla, especially the copper smelter, and there were many studies that were done concerned with the health and the environment of the individuals affected in that area, which clearly showed that there were some pretty noxious things coming out of the smelter. The smelter continued in operation until 1995. At that point, it was effectively closed, or more precisely, put on a program of care and maintenance only. Now, this followed industrial disputes, problems with the international price of copper, and environmental concerns, as well as regulations made by state government, making it more and more difficult to smelter copper, because the restrictions that were being put in place in order to protect the health and the environment of the community were making it more and more expensive to maintain the production of copper at Port Kembla. Now, at that point, the community thought that their fight was over, thought that the smelter was closed and that was the end of that. However, in 2000, the smelter reopened. It reopened following investment by a Japanese consortium of companies and by approvals provided by the state government, allowing it to recommence operations. That didn't last long, because after yet more complaints regarding pollution, after yet more concerns about the health and environmental impacts of the smelter, it again closed in 2003 and has remained closed since then. The last part of the story is that from 2009 onwards, there have been suggestions that the iconic stack that really dominates the skyline of Port Kembla is going to be demolished. Now, there's little chance that the smelter will resume operations. However, the period that I want to look at is the period in which the community was fighting the stack, was fighting the copper smelter, and when community action really did reach its peak, the late 1990s. Now, that community action culminated in two legal actions. The first was a questioning of the development approval, and the second was trying to get access to information about what the smelter was doing to the community. Now, to give a bit of background, since at least the 1940s, concerns have been raised about the health impacts of the heavy industry in Port Kembla. Specifically regarding the smelter, as I've said, there have been a number of studies showing the dangers of the air pollution produced in the smelting process. And that pollution has been linked to both environmental and health problems. So we get to the two main periods of community action. The first is the case taken by Helen Hamilton, who's here with us today, against the state government, essentially questioning the development approval for the reopening of the smelter. Now, that case was to begin on the 29th of May 1997. The case came after a frustrating period in which the concerned residents felt that they were not having their concerns heard. Their voice was not being listened to by the local and state representatives, nor by the organisations involved in the copper smelting process. In 1996, the residents of Port Kembla realised, with great surprise, that the planning minister of the day, Knowles, had consented to the smelter being reopened. There'd been little consultation, and the residents had serious concerns about the impact of the smelter reopening. A protest group formed. Initially it was called Residents Against the Smelter. It later grew into the broader group called Illawarra Residents Against Toxic Environments. And we have members of that group here with us. That was established in order to develop a better voice for the community. It organised surveys, it organised protests, it had letter writing to the elected representatives at local and state level. It started to get a lot of airtime. It got a lot of media coverage through the radio, through the TV and in the print media. In that process, the individuals and the community learned more and more about the process of development approval. What was actually involved in the state government trying to reopen the copper smelter? The community learnt more about the science involved, about the detailed impacts of the copper smelter on the community's health and environment. And finally, the group realised that all of their concerns were falling on deaf ears. So when all else failed, when all of the typical grassroots activism that you might expect, when people get together and are concerned about something, when all of that fails, the group decided to take legal action. Helen Hamilton, who was very courageous and remains very courageous, sorry?
Can I just say that we were also up against professional lobbyists?
True. Helen's just adding that the group was up against professional lobbyists at the time. It was certainly true. The Coalition for Economic Advancement was a group that was essentially funded through the industry in order to advance the industry's position of wanting to reopen and trying to reduce the voice of the community. There were a number of committees that were set up through the industry and government, including the Port Kembla Residents Committee, which was an attempt to show that the industry and government were getting feedback from the community. But as Helen and Olive and others can attest, it was an example of lip service being paid to the idea of consultation and getting the community's real views on the topic. There were very little records taken at the meetings. There was no documentation to actually show what the community was thinking. And so despite what seemed like formal attempts at getting the community's concerns into the government, into the industry, in the end you were pitted against industrial lobbyists and very powerful lobby groups. So Helen, being very courageous, decided to take the next step, which was legal action. And can I say, we do have Michael Sargent here with us, who is the legal aid solicitor involved in that case, who was an incredible resource, as I'm sure everyone can attest. Yep, twice.
No, we
needed each other. Okay, so Helen Hamilton took the action in her name. It was an action taken against the state government and against the developers trying to reopen the smelter. She was granted legal aid in the case, and Michael Sargent here was the legal aid solicitor working with Hamilton in that case. Volunteers, including law students from this university, were involved in the very tedious and time-consuming process of collecting the documentation required, because being a legal aid case, there obviously was not a huge team of lawyers in order to represent and assist the community compared to the legal teams on the other side, representing the state government and the companies involved. Tim Robertson, who is Jeffrey Robertson's brother, who you heard from in this course, was the barrister assigned to the case. Now, it seemed at that point that the community, working together with the legal system and with legal aid support, would succeed where the more informal avenues of having their voice heard, where that had failed. And so the residents felt, well, here we'll get taken seriously. We're collecting all of this documentation about why the approvals process was incorrectly done and why the smelter should not reopen. The community had the support of solicitors and a barrister and volunteers, and it seemed that looking at what the law said, the smelter should not reopen. However, despite the weeks and months of effort put in by all of those individuals, following the law and saying the law has not been applied, all of it was in vain. The night before the case was to start, not some time previously, but the very night before the case was to start in the Land and Environment Court, the New South Wales Government introduced legislation to make it all futile. The Port Kembla Special Provisions Act of 1997 effectively deemed the operation of the smelter and the opening of the smelter valid, and these are the words of the Act, despite the existence of or the decision in any proceedings pending in any court immediately before the commencement of this Act. So the legislation explicitly said, regardless of any preparation for court, regardless of whether or not that court case would succeed, the opening of the smelter is valid. End of story. Now, the reasons for this action taken by the state parliament or the state government was purportedly about saving jobs and stopping what the politicians called technical points of law interfering with the operation of industry. The Premier, the Minister for Planning and others within the government went on record both in the media and in the Parliament itself saying this is a technical point of law, it's stopping what should go ahead, and so on the eve of the case starting in the Land and Environment Court, after all of the effort to prepare it, that was essentially quashed and was made a complete waste of time. And that was a waste of time and public monies, because the legal aid money is public money and had been given to Helen to proceed with the case. Now, what was so shocking to Helen Hamilton, all of the members of Irate, the community group, and others beyond that, was that the person who introduced the legislation into Parliament was also a defendant in the case against Helen Hamilton. Through his position in the government, he had effectively made futile the case challenging his own decision to reopen the smelter. Now, there seem to be two factors at play here. The first was that the government must have been concerned that this case may have succeeded. This can be deduced from both the timing of the introduction of the legislation being the eve of the court case starting, and also the very fact that legal aid funding was provided. Because very few people get legal aid funding. In order to get it, the Legal Aid Commission has to determine the chance of succeeding in the case. If you have very little prospects of success, if you're doomed to fail, then you will not be provided with the legal aid monies. Now, in addition to the timing of the legislation, considering the legal aid funding that was provided, it suggests that the government realised it was in trouble. Why else rush through the introduction of this legislation so very late in the piece? It could have introduced the legislation as soon as they were made aware of the case being prepared. Perhaps more significantly than the fact that the state government thought they were going to lose, and regardless of the outcome of the case, perhaps the greater concern of the government was about what information would be revealed through the court case. Because obviously in that court case, Helen Hamilton, with all of her legal assistance, would have to show that the development approvals process was incorrect and things such as the environmental and health impacts of the smelter reopening had not been taken into account properly. So here we come to the second issue, the access to information. And this became the focus of the community's action after the court case, the first court case, was essentially made futile by the state government passing legislation. So on the 3rd of June 1997, only a few days after the original court case was to start and was made futile by the government's actions, Helen Hamilton made an application to the EPA, the Environmental Protection Authority, for the documents, for access to the documents that she thought would have been made available in the case with respect to the development approval. They refused to provide a lot of them. So Hamilton then took that to court, took the EPA to court to challenge the refusal. Again funded by Legal Aid and represented by Tim Robertson, together with the Public Interest Advocacy Centre, Helen Hamilton argued in the District Court that the EPA should have provided the documents. This time, Helen Hamilton won. And this case has been listed as a landmark case with respect to freedom of information. In this case, Helen Hamilton had argued that the way the EPA tried to avoid releasing the documents was against the Freedom of Information Act. Now, that Act says that generally government departments or agencies have to provide information that's requested by individuals, but that they can refuse to provide the information if one or more of the tests in the Act are satisfied. Now, there are too many tests and too much detail to go into all of the arguments now, but in summary, what the EPA had said, amongst a number of other things, was that the public interest would not be served by releasing a number of the documents, that the public may be confused, that there may be political embarrassment or repercussions on individuals in the department or agency if that material was released. What happened in that case was that Judge Ainsley Wallace said that it's irrelevant whether political embarrassment would be caused, and it's irrelevant whether there may be some confusion in the public. That cannot be a basis upon which you refuse giving the public information. So in the end, the community had some success. The community did get access to some of the information, vindicating their concerns about health and environmental impacts, and in the longer term, the smelter was closed. But what does this brief story that I've told you, what has any of that got to do with the main topics of this course? There are three main points I want to make, and then I'll open up for people to make comments, ask questions, and obviously for those involved in the copper smelter campaign to put in their perspective as well. First, I want to make a comment about representative democracy. Second, I want to make a comment about legal avenues and how the law can or may not be an assistance. And the last, a comment about self-education. And these 3 points I want to make in the context of talking about power and empowerment of the community. First, to representative democracy. Now, it's generally assumed that in Australia we have a system of representative democracy at the local, state and federal level, that the people have a say and are represented by their elected representatives at those three levels, and that those elected representatives are there to represent our views and to protect our position or our existence in our community. And so the idea is that the people are empowered through having that voice. You have a voice to your elected representatives, and they then exercise their voice on behalf of us in the arenas in which they make decisions, whether it's local, state or federal government. Now, while that may hold true at a very general level, the Port Kembla copper story shows that our system of government does not always work in that way, that the voices of the community are not always heard because of other structural limitations within our system. In this story, some of the local members did assist. Some of the local members did make positive and encouraging and supportive statements within the state government and within the state parliament. However, the main stumbling block was the party system. Obviously, you're all aware that we have two main parties at state and federal level, and those parties run very tight ships. It's very rare for individuals to dissent from their party's line. So in this area, obviously, we have quite stable Labor Party representatives, quite stable Labor electorates. A lot of the people involved in the copper smelter campaigns were quite staunch Labor supporters and traditional Labor supporters. However, the Labor Party did not take the same view as the community, and therefore, despite any encouraging or supportive statements by some local members, when it got to the vote in state parliament about the case and about the legislation to stop the case that Helen Hamilton had been running, in the end they all voted one way, which was to stop the case, to pass the legislation, because that was the Labor Party's view. Now, this problem really shows that although the community has some voice to their representative members within the state parliament, you can't then guarantee that the community is empowered by those representatives actually following through with actions in order to protect the community's concerns. Now, the second point I want to make is about legal avenues. Obviously, the community employed a number of tactics before going to court to try and have their voice heard and to have the concerns made clear to the community. In the end, Helen Hamilton had 2 attempts in court, took the legal avenue twice, failed once, succeeded once. Just on that basis, you could say, well, it might be worth a try, but you can only be guaranteed of having success in maybe half of the occasions. I'd say the success may be slightly less because, again, there are structural barriers. There are great cost barriers in order to use legal avenues to maintain a case against anybody. Helen had been very fortunate in order to get support from legal aid and to have a number of volunteers to assist her. But it still took a great amount of courage, a great amount of risk on her own part, and still a great amount of time and effort had to be involved. So while legal avenues can be of assistance, there's no guarantee that that's a certain way to empower the community. Sometimes, though, it does become very powerful, and that can be shown in the freedom of information case. That's an example where judges can truly assess the actions of state government, federal government agencies, departments, or individuals, and truly hold them to task against the rules of the law and against the limitations that should exist on their power. However, as we saw in the first case, the power of the Parliament itself is so powerful that sometimes it can override what the judges do. So I guess there's a mixed story about whether or not legal avenues will actually empower the community in the way one may assume. Now, despite the mixed success with the copper smelter story and with the avenues that were taken by the community and the individuals involved, I'd like to spend just a minute talking about self-education. Because by going through the whole protest movement, by using surveying and leafleting, by talking with the community, by engaging with the media, by trying the legal avenues, I'd say that all of those involved in the campaign went through a huge process of self-education. And through that, they were empowered, both in order to continue the fight that they were involved in at the time, being the fight against the reopening of the copper smelter, or the fight to obtain information with respect to the copper smelter. It's then very clear that that self-education and understanding of the processes that are involved in the society and understanding where power is held and how to use that power or fend off that power, that then continues beyond that one campaign. It's very clear that Helen and Olive and others who were involved in the campaign now have a great deal of understanding of how to get the community involved in different issues and how to have their voice heard. And so then they have then assisted other groups in order to fight their own fights, whether in the Illawarra or beyond. And so one idea of empowerment is not the traditional having a protest and having your voice heard, or going to court and trying to force someone to do what you want them to do. But one very important idea of community empowerment is merely education. That's through experience, and that's through assisting other people, and that's through bringing individuals and experts into your group to understand the system that you're fighting against or trying to work within. And so that I'd say that despite the setbacks and difficulty in any campaign, the overall experience of the community trying to take any action, whatever kind of action it may be, will lead to empowerment of the community as a whole because they are more educated in where power resides and how to use that power. So I'd like to leave my talk there and hopefully bring out some comments from you, some questions from you. I'm happy to take any questions you have, and also encourage anyone who was involved in the copper smelter story to put in your perspective as well, to add to the few comments that I've made. Yes?
How did you study or whatever it is from a lot of people from long perspective background, and a lot of people are scared to speak out because they're so ignorant. How do you come across as far as trying to get their support in campaign?
Well, I'll make a brief comment and then ask Helen or Olive to add to that. What I'd say is in the process of the copper smelter trying to reopen, there were actually concerns raised by the community that there was no consultation. And there was no consultation in the community languages. Because you're right, around Port Kembla and in many parts of the Illawarra, there's a very high proportion of non-English speaking background people. And so there were questions of whether any consultation could be adequate without translation or interpretation into the local languages.
Yeah, just on that point, it was a difficult situation how we used to ask that we have interpreters that demand for interpreters at meetings, and we just went down to the level into their cultures and things as well, and it was very difficult. On one occasion, the government used a petition that wasn't done correctly with the petition at the top, and these people come back later, we said, we signed it, we want the copper smelter. They said, no, we signed it for something else. They attached it to the back of the thing, and that's accepted by the government. So, there's a lot of things going on the way.
Other questions or comments? Yes?
Given the fact, I'll raise my voice out, I'm not given the fact that
I'll repeat the question if you...
The fact that the establishment started operating in 1903, whatever the date was. I would assume then there was no development application. Therefore, they started up. Would not the operation that have consent?
Okay, I think you're asking a question that given the copper smelter had been in operation since 1908, then it could be assumed that they're just allowed to continue. Is that what the question? Yeah. And so that's true, but in the 1960s, and I didn't go into this detail, but in the 1960s and beyond, the state government and the state parliament started to introduce legislation about air pollution and about environmental controls. What that did was say you can continue to operate, but you now have to comply with these limitations. You can't allow certain chemicals into the air, you can't pollute to a certain extent anymore. And so it affected the operations. So what happened was, as copper prices went down internationally, as industrial disputes occurred at Port Kembla, and as residents started to make complaints about health and environmental concerns, then those limitations meant that the copper smelter was questioning whether or not it should continue to operate. And that's why, in the end, it did cease operations in the mid-90s. Because it had consent to operate, but it could no longer justify it because it was becoming too expensive to comply with all of the environmental regulations, amongst other things that were happening.
Were there any health surveys done, and what were the results of them? Were there costly?
The question was about health surveys. Yes, health surveys had been done over the decades. Some very obvious ones dealing with lead levels in blood in Port Kembla, issues of cancer clusters throughout that part of the Illawarra, questions of what was in the dust in roofs, what was in the soil in backyards, what then went through to vegetables grown in the backyards. There were certainly health surveys done by both the health department and others saying that there were raised levels of toxins in a number of places and that there were problems with levels of lead amongst other issues in the people throughout the Illawarra. So there was no doubt that there were health concerns and science to back it up. I guess if you're taking a strict legal view, the problem is to actually draw the link between the copper smelter, as distinct from perhaps other parts of the heavy industry, and that lead that's in that backyard or that sulphur dioxide that's over there. What link was drawn was that a number of issues of acid rain fallout, so the sulphur dioxide gets released from the copper smelting process, it then rains, draws it down, and essentially burns small portions of cars or roofs, has some kind of impact. That link was drawn because it was a very clear one. But there were health surveys done that showed there were problems, but the difficulty was, how can you pinpoint that on one particular part of the industry, considering that there were so many heavy industries operating in the area?
Just add to that, when some of the surveys were done on the Philippines too, that we will be whitewashed in figures.
Yes?
My question is basically whether anyone examined the rationale why the state company is so keen to play a special provision for the transport explorer to meet. Well, I mean, my understanding, I recall, there wasn't many actual jobs with the smelter. So did people getting information or speculate about whether the state revenue or any other reason the state government was so keen to get it through?
Can I say it wasn't the first and only time that the state government had done that. The Carr government basically got into a practice of when it wanted to do something, whether it was because of links with industry or because it was their policy and they just wanted to see it happen, they would pass special provisions legislation. So they did it 4 or 5 or 6 times, I can't remember the exact amount, where they would essentially say, we know legislation exists for a reason, we know court cases exist for a reason, but we're going to wash it all away and say this is what we're doing, regardless of people questioning the impacts and regardless of court cases going ahead. Now, in this instance, the very strong statements by the state government were about jobs. We want to protect jobs. It is true that the number of jobs were dwindling, and even across the whole heavy industry sector, the number of jobs were dwindling. But that was the position of the state government at the time.
Just maybe one more question. I'm aware of the time, so...
In terms of ongoing health issues for people who maybe got sick after this finished.
So is that a question coming from me?
bigger? Or as a follow-up to that, a similar line, that all a government needs is some sort of excuse to push an act through, and thinking of the sedition laws of Mauritania and all the laws they brought in, which was overnight, with no consultation, and they're allowed to do that as well, with any sort of excuse.
So are you asking, are they allowed to do that?
Sort of, yes. I mean, I could just think of an excuse and then that night push it through the next day, and that's in writing.
Yeah, that's true. I guess basically the power of the state parliament or the federal parliament is to pass legislation. They're allowed to do it, they don't have to consult, and as long as a majority passes it in both houses and is passed by the governor or governor-general, it becomes law. So it's just an example of how what we think is representative democracy may not always actually follow through into how we think it should work.
Well, good afternoon, colleagues, and colleagues also at a number of other campuses. I certainly have had a lot of experience, I will have to say that. In fact, Mr. Latham, the former Labor leader, described me, not very flatteringly, just recently, but some said that was a compliment, by the way, as the veteran of the welfare research industry, I suppose he called it. I wrote a reply saying that to be called a Marxist at my stage of life was quite a compliment. It meant that I was still alive and having some ideas. But anyway, that's in the background. I certainly don't bring to this forum any set recipe of how to succeed in efforts to make our society more just, fair, and showing more concern for the well-being of those who are most disadvantaged. But what I am going to do is to suggest, just as we've heard in the previous speech, that the law can be a very useful tool in your endeavours. So too can the collation of information, what I often call social arithmetic, because it's very frequently the case that something not too complicated, but just patiently worked up and presented in the right way, with a little passion, will bring about success. Now, I'm not dwelling too much on the failures this afternoon. I'm presenting to you, first of all, in the first half of my talk, a quick succession of instances in which going to the trouble of collecting some information has paid off, and paid off quite handsomely. In the second half, I'll concentrate much more on one single case study, and that is the inquiry into public education, because I think there are a lot of lessons that at least you want to reflect upon from that experience. Now, one of the things that was mentioned in the previous speech was the importance of legal aid to your endeavours. Now, it is the case that a national scheme of legal aid in this country is of comparatively recent origin. I mean, we're talking about the late 70s, 1970s. Up to that time in New South Wales, there was a semi-charitable scheme which probably was affected by all sorts of moral considerations rather than your entitlement for assistance. But at that time, working in the Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research, we were positioned to be able to look at the cases where people were legally represented and those where they were not legally represented, and in most other respects, seemingly matched. What difference did it make to have a legal spokesperson or representative assisting you with your case? Now, the results of those tabulations were not all that complex. You could do them. You would need to have access to the information. And perhaps in some ways, I'm inclined to think that maybe it was a little easier in the 2 or 3 decades ago than it is today. It seems to be, if anything, despite the legislation and freedom of information, sometimes I get a knockback where once it would have been relatively easy to get the information required. But before you was a simple table. In the Bureau in those days, and I think in legal circles generally, if you were to go before the local court, it was then called the Court of Petty Sessions, and you got either a slap on the wrist with a feather or found not guilty, there wasn't a huge difference between those two results. The slap on the wrist with a feather was what they called a 556A dismissal, which kind of reflected a brilliant capacity of the law to say one thing and mean another. It meant, as I understood it, that you were found to have committed the offence, but it won't be recorded and we'll treat you as though it didn't happen. So either of those two results in appearances before the low court were very desirable, and one was almost as good as the other. Now, if you look at that table, we're looking at cases appearing before the lower court at a time when there was no systematic scheme of legal representation, but some people were represented, some were not. What can you see immediately? Can our colleagues see this at the other campuses, by the way? Is that working that way? Okay. What can you see? Surely an advantage in being represented, because you were, if you combine those first two categories, not guilty and 556A dismissal, what's the ratio? 7, 8, what is it? 9.2% in the right-hand column. Have I done that right? I'm a bit nervous here this afternoon. And then in the central column, 27.7. So a threefold advantage where all of the people involved had no previous convictions. Now, an obvious question to ask is, but did it make a difference depending on the kind of offence category that you were involved in? So we, of course, proceeded to do that. And all you have to do is to pull out all the cases where the offence was in the category summary offences, larceny, or whatever. And we found in every instance that that ratio either stood up or increased. In other words, you were highly advantaged by being legally represented. Now today, looking back on that, you think, well, that should have immediately seen something happen. Well, the response wasn't that at all. We always have a great capacity in society to justify whatever's been going on for a long time. So the first rebuke that I received from bringing this material to light was, you're going to clog the courts. People are going to want to be represented. It's going to slow everything down. You're going to be responsible for a great logjam in the courts. But fortunately, and I want to say this about most of the projects that I'm presenting this afternoon, you almost, not always, but it's very, very favourable if someone in the background considers what you've just tabled to be a dream form of assistance to something they want to achieve. So the National Attorney General at the time was Lionel Murphy, and within a flash he was onto this material. So too were some people in the state legislature, and in no time at all we had an improved state system, but we had the introduction of a national legal aid scheme. So no piece of research, by my reckoning, is going to by itself, independently of what people have been thinking up to this point, suddenly cause a conversion. What it can do is facilitate and enable groups like you to capitalise on this information and try and get the result that you want. And I've described what the result was in this case. Now here's an even more, as I look back at it, an even more incredible example of where the collection of a little bit of information wrought wonders at that time. In 1854, let's go back 120 years or so, because that's what it was when the New South Wales Parliament held an inquiry into the futility of the way in which we were dealing at that time, in the 19th century, with vagrant, drunken people. And the phenomenon of the swinging door was well and truly established 120 years before we did this research. And they lamented, as we often do, that's how we do this, and we're not looking for a way forward. Well, they were interested in a way forward, but like a lot of things, it just was stymied and nothing happened for 120 years. So we decided to ride with the police in the city of Sydney and look at the statistics, calculate a few things of our own, And we found, to our amazement, that 30% of the admissions to prison in New South Wales just a few decades ago, 30% of them were for public drunkenness. And attendant risks, by the way, that you might be sent off for what was called treatment at a psychiatric hospital, where nothing at all happened, except once this research came out, they started to use the breathalyzer on people who were in custody at that time. 30% of the admissions to prison, 33% of the arrests in New South Wales were for public drunkenness. So we thought, well, one way, a valuable way of collecting information here would be to ride the paddy wagon. So we did, with the police, to see how things went. I can well remember driving down near the Haymarket area and saying to the police on the second or third night, I notice we always come to this side of the street to do the trawling, or was I game enough to put it that way? And the sergeant said yes, because we know the crook ones are over here, all those pubs over there, there's no one whom we need to take into custody. They were somewhat more respectable hotels, you could say, in the ordinary parlance. So we collected information on 10,000 of these people who were being arrested for public drunkenness. Sometimes, of course, there's a bit of humour, what we sometimes call black humour, mixed up with all the rest of it. And I remember at one hotel, a man escaping arrest by climbing out a window and accidentally stepping on an observer, my feet. And the sergeant said to him, not only drunk in public, but assaulting this gentleman. This ought to be worth more, he said. Until I interceded and begged for that not to happen. But anyway, we collected information on 10,000 people. Some quite well-known names amongst the 10,000. Jesus was there repeatedly. Gandhi made a fine showing as well. Some politicians who remain nameless were there. But we managed by that time to know who was Jesus and who was Gandhi, and we did some separate calculations and came to the conclusion that 7% of those arrested were accounting for 1 in 4 of all the arrests over that period of 3 months. So there was a core group of repeat offenders. We thought, well, why are we doing this? And we spoke to some of the magistrates and they said, well, I think the words were something like this. It's remarkable, isn't it, how you can remember these anecdotes when you're pressed. But the magistrate said, would you like your wife to come across one of these people in the streets of Sydney? And that was the kind of rationale. It was a kind of hygiene movement. Send around not the garbage truck, but the human garbage truck and collect all these people. So we checked out probably in breach of everything that we today consider the rights of the individuals and sacredness of criminal records. But anyway, we checked out the offence records of those arrested against a cross-section of Sydney men living in the city of Sydney, and there was no difference. No difference when it came to offences against the person, which is what people were more worried about. Identical, in fact. Now, what did people do when they were arrested? The wise ones would stick the bail money in their shoe before they embarked on the evening's entertainment. The police knew them and knew where they secreted their bail money, so they only had to be arrested, brought before a sort of hearing, and they were off. They excused themselves thereafter. Nobody went looking for them from the processes that followed. They exempted themselves from the risk of going to jail. They exempted themselves from the risk of being put in a psychiatric hospital with no treatment for them. And sometimes it was for quite a substantial period. So that seemed grossly unfair, and people would generally, I think, understand that that wasn't a good way of going about things. But it was the poorest of the poor who remained, and they were exposed to those hazards. Well, now, we decided the next thing we should do was interview people as they were coming out of jail on the threshold, just coming back into the community and asked them what was ahead. Here's just a small sample of the people we interviewed. I'll get a permanent job, permanent place to live, but I've been saying that for a while. I'll try and get off it. I don't think I'll be successful indefinitely. I'll try, but the trouble is I finish up putting the bottle to my mouth just like a little baby. If I go out broke, what can I do? And that was pretty representative of what they were telling us about the prospects that were ahead. So we also thought this might be an occasion for a few photos. And I don't know, today I'd probably be too sensitive to do what we did then. We were pretty brash, we were confident we could move things forward. And we took some photos of some of the people arrested in the circumstances in which they were found. And here was a gentleman in repose, quite out to it. And we took the photo, and 1 minute later he was dead. So we pondered, is that a fair thing to do as part of telling the community about the way it's dealing with these issues, to use that photo? And we decided it was. So what we did was have a series of reports. You'll find in most of the things I'm describing, I believe in serialising things. People only take in a little bit at a time. So we talked about who these people were in one release, in another release, what might be done, and I've forgotten what the other one was. Anyway, we went to the trouble of wanting to say to the society, and here I think is a vital lesson for a group like this, we wanted to say, it doesn't have to be this way. You've heard what they're saying, you've heard about the circumstances, there is a better way of dealing with this, and it's actually operating in some places. What we need is a place where people who might be at risk of harming themselves can sober up. Forget about the courts, forget about the jails, sober up, and then offer a range of possible forms of assistance. So we need a sobering up spot, we need vehicles to bring people to that area, and we need a hub of different organisations to assist. Now I've got to tell you that the disclosure of this material, statistics intermingled with the human implications of the numbers, a public forum at which the then Minister for Justice, Mr. Madison, participated, the magistrates participated, the society was shamed into stopping that ridiculous practice, the swinging door practice. Now, I put it that way because a magistrate, you remember Walter Lua, I should think, rang me up and said, Tony, we think you're wrong, but from tomorrow, no magistrate will send anyone to jail for this offence. 1 year later, the law was changed to tidy up. But the reality of the change was there from that phone call. He had it in his usual way. He's living in Queensland. This doesn't go there, I trust. Just give me a call if any silly magistrate uses the old measures and I'll kick him up the bum. So that's how it finished. Again, collecting information, some figures, of course a bit of passion as well. If that's not present, I think it'll be in one ear and out the other. And the education experience or project will tell that story even better. Okay, so it can sometimes work. Now, more recently, in the last couple of years, I've been involved in doing something that people sometimes say to me, but doesn't everyone know that social disadvantage is unevenly distributed? And I say, yes, that's true. We probably all know that. So what do we do about it? What do we do about it? And my idea with colleagues has been, we will confront the society and we'll confront the premiers and the ministers and the politicians and everyone else who matters in this respect that we want change with the basic facts. And we will show them what it means in terms of comparisons with the rest of the society to be living and bringing up your children in such locations. So our general perspective was as written on before you right now. We're an accumulation of problems makes a serious impact on the well-being of residents of a disadvantaged area. Locality-specific measures may be needed to supplement the general social policy. Now, there's something important in that, and I'd have to elaborate. I did elaborate it much more in conversations with policymakers. We're not here trying to invent another whole social security system. We're saying that in a minority of areas, the disadvantage is so marked that you can't just rely upon those social provisions which get the majority of people over humps in life and out of trouble. And we also have to tell you, in the light of both earlier studies that I've been involved in, but also the most authoritative studies coming from the UK, amongst other places, that where early disadvantages, where you have early disadvantages in life, say in the first year or two of life, then they tend to accumulate in people's lives. And that's so well documented. Okay, in order to do this essentially mapping exercise, we used a large number of indicators. I think Mr. Pearce touched on this in his presentation, but anyway, some that had to do with low income, the sorts of things that people ordinarily think of as connected. You can read that, okay? Home purchase stress. In the field of health, low birth weights, so at the start of life, childhood injuries, all the way through, immunisation, disability and sickness support, life expectancy itself, psychiatric patients. Basically, that was based on hospital data rather than community treatment. That's still to come. Suicide, then community safety, child maltreatment, criminal convictions, imprisonment, domestic violence. Then a number of economic variables that people would again fairly readily associate with disadvantage, and then some that were extremely important to do with education. Non-attendance at preschool within a certain age range. Incomplete education. Now, incomplete education meant 17 to 24-year-olds who were not finishing high school, not undertaking any form of training and not going on to university. And that's become an important international indicator of how our young adults are faring. That one. Even the general level of education within an area has a big connection with cumulative disadvantage and, of course, post-schooling qualifications. Now, when you apply that to postcode areas, some 700 of them in New South Wales, a more or less equal number in Victoria, statistical local areas in Queensland and South Australia, local government areas in Western Australia, a very uniform picture emerges, which is similar to what colleagues and I were finding 30 years ago. Indeed, the most striking thing for me is to see the same places prominently disadvantaged compared with everywhere else today that were in that situation 2 or 3 decades ago. Anyway, the converging evidence, you can read that, so I'll just say, think of it as an unfolding life. It starts with poor engagement in education, either not having exposure to it at the very earliest stages, not having parental backing that's enthusiastic about the importance of education, not attaining by mid-primary the most basic skills of being able to read a bit, add a few things up. I don't think anything in my professional life prepared me for what I found when I went to 20 preschools attached to public schools in highly disadvantaged areas. As a former chief screw of New South Wales, nothing had prepared me to find children aged 4 who had 1 or 2 words to their name. Little girls who would say when the teacher said, boys go here, girls go there, obliged to ask the teacher, what am I? Or in effect, what am I? Kids who had never held a pencil in their hand or opened a book before, had no concept of what a book was. Children who spend 99% of their time within the bounds of their own suburb, and when you ask them in the news, as you know, it goes on in school, What's happened the last week? Went shopping, to a point where well-informed schools take those kids, age 4, into the city to show them the city for the first time in Sydney. And I've witnessed it, they're awestruck. What's this tall building? One little girl said, going across the Harbour Bridge, are we in Lebanon yet? Now, you know, it just shakes you to your foundations when you experience this. So there is a proportion of kids coming from the areas that we can identify as most disadvantaged, with limited education, for whom school becomes a form of torture by the time you're still in primary. You resort to other ways of attracting a bit of attention, getting up the teacher's nose, getting up the nose of the other kids. When I took a class in Burke and talked to the kids in about 3rd class, you know what my job is? I've got to try and see if we can make some improvements. What would be your number one? And they just said, get rid of him. Excuse me. Gentlemen, because I have to point to the men. him and him. That will improve things greatly. And then by the time you enter secondary, it's escape at every opportunity. So you progress to the next stage of having no credentials, nothing to float yourself on the labour market with at all. And interestingly enough, health and disabilities are then, maybe they're antecedent to that happening, but they also seem to cluster around being in that situation. Low individual and family income, of course. And then when you talk to kids, say in inner Sydney, about how do you make ends meet, because they're, what do we say, sofa surfing, just living away from home and so on, and they just tell you after meeting you 10 minutes later, well, I did a burglary last night, I snatched a bag yesterday, and so that's how I make ends meet. And where you have concentrations of all these things, it's not a uniform development, but where these things are fairly massively concentrated, that's where you find large quantities of child maltreatment. Okay. Now, these things I want to stress are, time gets away, are not here today and gone tomorrow. Each time I've been involved in a study of this kind, we've looked at the correlation or the similarity in the order of places from one study to the next. And, you know, for those who were tortured once in statistics courses, in these sorts of places, the correlations are of the order of 0.85 to 0.9, beyond 0.9. They just remain. So much so, I was telling Mr. Brax, who invited me in for a talk in Victoria when he was the Premier, I showed him the map of the concentrations of disadvantage in Victoria, and I had over here maps for the previous surveys. He said, Tony, you've made a mistake. You've reproduced the same map. And I said, no, I haven't. Society has reproduced disadvantage in this period as it had previously. Okay, so look, I think enough said. You keep getting the same patterns coming out time and again. It's not cast in concrete, but it's very, very stable. Now, these categories, when you identify the areas that are most disadvantaged, they're not the sort of things that people like us race off and write a paper about, and people say, oh, statistically significant, humanly significant. Look at this. If you take the 3% most disadvantaged places in Western Australia and compare it with the other 97%, the prison admissions are 15 times higher. Can you imagine? 15 times higher? I would have thought double would be bad enough, but 15 times. Long-term unemployment, 5.5 times. Disability and sickness support, 5 times. I don't need to, you can see this, can't you? Okay, I won't just keep reading it. But let's look at New South Wales. Child maltreatment, 4.5 times higher in the most disadvantaged areas. Prison admissions, 3.5 times. Can I tell you, this is after taking into account the makeup of the areas. How many, for example, if you're looking at prison admissions, how many people between 18 and 50 are there? Because that's the age range from which they're drawn. But if you just look crudely at Victoria and say, how many postcodes out of the 700 in Victoria do you need to go to get 1 in 4 of all the prisoners in Victoria today. 2%. 2% of the postcodes. To get half, can't remember now, but it's probably about 5%. Okay? So every way you look at it, spatially and in terms of the rates, you get this situation. Okay. Now what about New South Wales? I have a colleague here from Centrelink. Where are you? Yeah. You can tell me if I'm going too far, okay? I need a bit of guidance here. If you just look at the places that in 2007 were most disadvantaged, and they're arranged in bands, and that's the top 40 ranking out of 700 in New South Wales, well, you see a pretty strong representation from country areas, don't you? And you see Windale, which was the most disadvantaged place in southeastern Australia on all the previous studies I've done, still there, and so on. But I just wanted to say, included on this occasion, but also on all the previous occasions in the top 40. So we're talking about the top ranking 5% of areas in New South Wales on disadvantage. Here's a local one, isn't it? Wollongong. Now, what does, so it's all there, and there's a bit more to say about it, but this gives us a moment to say, to pause and say, well, so what? What happens from all this? You've got a hell of a lot of trouble. It took a year to persuade all the states to give us the stuff and that. Is it worth it? Is it worth the candle? Well, let's just take the example of Centrelink, if we may, and without presuming any knowledge of what will be the final policy, but we've talked about this within Centrelink in eastern Sydney, which means, where does it stop? Bega or somewhere? Nowra, okay, stops at Nowra. Wollongong has come up every time one's done this sort of study. Now, one of the things that on the Social Inclusion Board that I'm on, the Commonwealth Social Inclusion Board, that some of us are very worried about is this corralling of payments and other, well, they're called incentives or disincentives, I suppose, in order to get people to do things that are considered right, get their kids to school, to take work and so on. Now, there are some Centrelink offices that it's been my privilege to go to where they either have already marshalled their resources to say, yes, the government has decreed that, but we're going to intervene with such vigour as to make it near impossible for that to happen. Is that a fair statement? Now, the Eastern Sydney, that is Tanara, region, is currently considering how and where it might do something similar. And so this sort of information, we're not here saying this is going to happen, only that when you're having that sort of consideration, to be able to look at that, you can say, well, Wollongong would be a candidate, wouldn't it? Is that fair to say that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
As you say, for 3 decades, the situation has deteriorated further.
Yes.
Youth unemployment, I think, is something like between the age of 15 and 17.
Yes. Yeah. But it goes further than that. But again, just as Mr. Justice Murphy was greatly influenced by that other data, the Deputy Prime Minister has taken a very strong interest in this material. And when it was launched in Parliament House in Canberra, she was there, she was in the second row or front row, she took it in. And whenever you hear her talk about social inclusion now, which is a new phrase that's being used quite a lot, she'll refer to this, usually refer to this study or the implications of this study. And so we're beginning to see this material infiltrate into policy decisions. For example, there is 20 areas have been chosen around Australia for special funding for job support, and they accord pretty highly with the rankings in this study. And so it goes. There's a big push at the moment as certain educational programs unfold, that I'll come to now, to make sure that the starting point are the areas that are most cumulatively disadvantaged. So that's another indication that, although it can be a pain in the neck, collecting all this stuff and processing it. Now, there was a little bit, there was a simple way of doing this and there was a slightly more academic and torturous way of doing it. Well, obviously I did it the academic and torturous way. And that involved a bit more than just add-ups, some statistics, collapsing all those different indicators into one summary score. But I want to say this, that there are people in universities just waiting to be invited to assist with anything like that. They are. I've never had, I myself use them, math stats people, and that would never be a big problem. Okay. There's New South Wales. Now, there's another hint here that if you can reduce it all to a pictorial version, it seems to get a lot more interest in circles where people reckon they haven't got much time to read reports. Certainly that's been the case. In the darker the area, the red area, of course, they're the most disadvantaged locations by my lights in New South Wales. Okay, I'm just advocating that to use some visual symbol, some visual condensation, they call them condensational symbols, of data is a really good way of going forward if it's possible. Okay. Yeah, look, I think time is a bit against me spending too much time now on Mildura. You heard a bit about that. But the same sort of thing has happened in Mildura. I'll just put it very briefly. The local government of Mildura, the election before last, the last one wasn't quite so good for what I'm about to say, decided that Mildura should be, it had all the advantages, sufficient to make a bold claim that Mildura will be the most livable, mutually supporting place in Australia. That was council promulgated statement about the future of Mildura. And everyone got excited and said, that's terrific. And then, as happens with such statements of intent, people say, well, what are we going to start with? This is where a bit of social arithmetic can be of great help in identifying obvious points of interest. Now, Mr. Pearce himself helped to establish with council a governance group comprised of council staff, professionals in the area, citizens of the area, to receive such information as could be garnered about what ought to be matters of priority in beginning to move in the direction of making Mildura Australia's most livable place. The study was, that I was involved in was more comprehensive than just conventional health and welfare problems. The most livable place in Australia would also have good libraries, well-used libraries, would have well-used art galleries, would have well-used theatres and so on. So we arranged that everyone who visited the art gallery would simply give, you know, the way they say, what's your postcode? And we built up a picture of who was using the art gallery, and we found that it was a very small part of Mildura indeed. Now, sterile information if it's just left at that, but the art gallery manager, being a very broad-thinking person, has acted on this and has begun to take art out into the parts of Mildura and region where there is at present little patronage of the art gallery. We have had exhibitions at some of the schools, particularly the most disadvantaged school in Mildura has been the venue for art displays involving the children and local residents and so on. So it's been utilised. And likewise with the libraries, less of the inequitable distribution of custom, but more the level of custom. It's very low, and people are beginning to try and do something about that. One of the difficulties that we've experienced in Mildura is that if you identify some of the problems that I'll now quickly refer to, for example, just skip down there to psychiatric admissions. The psychiatric admissions within Mildura are twice as frequent, or the rate is twice as high as regional Victoria, and people have naturally said, well, that's pretty serious. What's behind that? And the authorities in that field, their first response, and this has not been typical of the whole of Mildura and other problems, but their first response was to say, we know what it is. We don't have any community facilities. It's not that everyone here is suffering from psychiatric illness. We just don't have any other way of dealing with it. Fine. The indicators served a very useful purpose, has it not? That instead of treating on an inpatient basis, you can now say, well, let's make a push for more alternative forms of treatment in the community, and that's what's happening. It's also been very important to point out to Mildura that there are some of the areas canvassed where they are doing quite well. Life expectancy is quite high. Immunisation levels are high. Low birth weights are just what they should be. Farm accidents are not high, and so on. So I'm now keen just to move on to the school example, because I think that's what our debate and conversation might well be about. Okay, in 2001, I had the surprising invitation to chair a public inquiry, an independent inquiry into public education in New South Wales. As to why it happened, I think I'd been trying to assist a school in a rather disadvantaged area with a mentor scheme. Anyway, I was lucky enough to be drawn out of the hat. My joy at hearing this was matched by a recognition that I had the backing of some of the main opponents of governments, Liberal, Labor, whatever, in New South Wales. The Teachers Federation. The Teachers Federation is in the news this week, is it not? Another brawl coming on. Well, I have... Pardon? Sorry.
League tables?
Yes, league tables, that's the one. I thought, well, a lot of work's going to go into this. It's going to be a year. It's going to be very intense. Before the year is over, I will have personally visited 200 schools throughout the whole of New South Wales, sat in classrooms, spoken with kids, spoken with teachers, spoken with parents. How do I know this will be taken seriously? And the company I'm keeping in this looks pretty dubious from a political perspective. So I went straight down and saw the Minister for Education. I then went and saw the Shadow Minister for Education. I went and saw the Director General of Education and said, I believe I'm quite capable of being utterly independent with colleagues in this exercise. Can you accept that? Seemed to take the wind out of their sails. But it would have been pointless starting off on any other basis than that, I reckon. And also, I said, we don't want to be in the situation where every time we want to go to a school, we've got to write letters, make submissions. We've got to move very quickly. This is a job. Well, the final product was this book, and it took a lot of data processing and collection and writing and everything to fit all that into 1 year. So a protocol was fashioned, which meant that our entry to schools and whatever we needed to do would be expedited, and it worked beautifully. But thank heavens we went to the trouble of setting that up at the beginning. As to the base that we would operate from, the government itself, having gone as far as it had in responding to the initial requests, quickly deemed that we should take very ample offices that they owned in the Redfern Industrial Centre, you know, the one what's it called? Everleigh, the Everleigh Centre, that's right. And that was terrific. And I've got to say, I'm pretty proud of the fact, as far as the independence is concerned, that within 3 months they offered to cover every expense, that is the government. Now, the people who'd supported this, the P&C of New South Wales, the Teachers Federation, the associations of principals, had in mind that the inquiry would be like the sort of inquiry that used to take place rather periodically in the past in New South Wales, and a whole area of administration would be reviewed, and there's usually room for improvement somewhere, but it would be like that. And before long, it started to take on a quasi-official appearance, because nobody was objecting. The government was involved in supporting it. And I would say that although it was termed independent inquiry, it was independent. And some of the things that were recommended were the fruits of that independence and went right against what the Teachers Federation policies were. I'll give you two quick examples. One was to go to schools where the brightest of our children were being educated, say Sydney Girls High, and just be in a room with 10 or 15 of those young adults the electricity snapping the air. They were so bright. And the principal said to us, you know, we have to take teachers on a roster to teach these children. And it turns out the dullest person in the room sometimes is the teacher, or the least prepared for this role is the teacher, because these kids are so up with everything. Postmodern English literature, for example. People who graduated from university 20 years earlier but had done their duty and come through and up the ranks, they wouldn't have been able to effectively educate these kids on something like postmodern theory and literature. So we recommended that the principal must have, now it was the thin edge of the wedge thing, because we knew if you went too far, the whole thing would collapse on you. But we said, I think it was 10% of appointments should be at the discretion of the principal. And that went down like a lead balloon with the unions. But if the aim was to get the best possible education system up, then you had to sometimes say things like that. And there were other examples that I might mention. The philosophy of this exercise was, well, we're going to enhance social equity in New South Wales by improving public education. Now intuitions play a part. I was the chair of it, the leader of it. I had two very excellent colleagues, but I suppose it rested on my shoulders to decide, since it was called the Vinson Inquiry, how we would conceive of this. And my conception was, we're living in a state that is anything but adventurous in social policy and social administration, anything but. Usually the last one to pick up whatever it is that the other states have already adopted. So it is a sure path to disaster to see this as an academic exercise, a radical exercise. What it must be is a highly progressive exercise that will improve the education system, and people will feel that way about it, and then that can be a platform upon which others can take it further if they wish. So it was not conservative, but it certainly was not radical. And that judgment has to be made, I suspect, by anyone in this sort of field. Where will our authority come from? The previous speaker spoke of the importance of voice, communal voice. We saw it that way. We saw that we were really providing an opportunity for teachers, parents, students, all people involved in the public education system to have their say. It was not going to be simply what they said, because we disagreed sometimes, but first and foremost, and if you ever pick this thing up, you'll see every chapter begins with a couple of pages of what we were told. That was to be the authority. That's the style of the report. The methodology would include hearings. We would conduct up to 30 hearings around the state in Brewarrina, Walgett, the suburbs of Sydney, a couple on the south coast, and so on. We would also make visits to schools, but they would not be visits where we passively asked people what went on here. We wished to sit in the classroom and observe what transpired. And we would receive submissions, of which we received some 700. We provided constant feedback. Now, I'm telling you this because this thing worked like a charm. This is not the most important thing I've been involved in. The prisons was the most important thing I've been involved in. But this was, on the surface anyway, the most successful of all the ventures I've been in. So I'm trying to say, what the hell did we do right? And we did a few things right. One of them was to provide constant feedback to everyone. A beautiful website, not like the one that's not working at the moment for this course, maintained by experts. We were totally accessible to the media. I can tell you I would walk out the front gate of a school and be having a radio interview on what happened in that visit to that school and what was said and so on. People came alive. We carried our supporters and interested people forward by a variety of means, by giving talks within the Department of Education, by very regular meetings with the Minister, Mr. Watkins, at that time, and also with the politicians. Mr. Brogden was the leader of the opposition, and Mr. O'Farrell was the shadow education, well, spokesperson or shadow minister, We had constant meetings with those people, just as we did with the government, and we reserved the right to inform any politician on any aspect of what we were discovering. We broke with tradition. I think I put it up here, be inspired by Charles Dickens. Usually with reports, imagine this one, they call them doorstops, and people bring them out at the end, and there's a bit of a media flurry, and they're keeping the door open within a week. I've been around long enough to know that that's a disastrous way of proceeding, so we serialised our report. We had after about 6 months' work, every month or so, we would have announcements. We would bring the media into a school, and we would have a press conference in the school. We would talk about this issue or that issue, and that seemed to work very well. The editor of the Sydney Morning Herald wrote me a note at one stage and said, "Who you got working up there with you, Charles Dickens?" And we would make a point of drawing progressive responses from the minister. For example, at one time we calculated there was one school counsellor for every 1,000 students. And when we interviewed the school counsellors, we found 50% of their time was spent clerking various applications that they had to put their signature on for things like assistance for kids with disabilities and so on. 50% of their time was going on that. So we recommended another 700, and Mr. Watkins in one go, but nothing's happened since, unfortunately, appointed another 140 school counsellors. Now, I know from this inquiry and a few others I've been on, if you're not careful, you're setting the thing up for some kind of symbolic reaction at the end. You use the thing while it's alive to get as much as you can of what you're going to recommend. That happened in an inquiry I did in Canberra and elsewhere, and it works very well. But if you wait till the end, we've done something. We gave you this, or we gave you that, now we'll go over here and do something about this group that's lobbying us for something else. Okay, well, what were some of the issues? I'll just quickly talk about the politics of it in a moment. But one of the things that we did was on every occasion, every meeting, we identified shortcomings that were coming to light. But we made a point of emphasising some of the good features that we were finding within the system. My reckoning there was, if the politicians only hear bad news, they're going to go and try and get some kudos somewhere where there's some scope for it. This sounds like a disaster over here. I even tried my luck by trying to present a humorous talk on crises in modern society. At that time, the chief referee at Rugby League had said there was a referee crisis, so that got a run. And a whole lot of others. And I said, no, we don't really find the public education system to be in crisis. We will tell you many things that will improve it, but it's not in crisis, because if you define something as crisis, it's a turn-off completely. The other thing I did, which is another hint, I'm trying to give you hints from the successful one, was to sit down and say at the beginning, what would be the maximum increase over current expenditure that the state government, if we did a first-class job and persuaded them to spend money, what would be the ceiling of what they would ever be likely to cough up before they decided there was more advantage to them in calling the whole thing conceived in fairyland, you know, that it's all a group of academics coming up with impossible dreams. And I calculated 10%. Now, that was $600,000 because the investment at the time in public education was $6 billion. That's, so we worked backwards. From that, the priorities were determined with an attitude on our part of what would be the threshold beyond which we'll get nothing for public, or very little for public education. Some of the issues, very quickly, I'll try and take no more than another 5 minutes. Some of the issues were the teachers feel that they were not able to exercise their professional discretion in any way, that they were given recipes from which to teach, that a professional straitjacket was placed on them. They were dominated by the demands of the central administration. The idea of professional discretion, adapting what was being taught to match these children, this community, was not tolerated. So in the light of that, we thought, well, how much support are they getting each year? Now, this is where the social arithmetic is very helpful. Nobody had previously calculated this, yet it's so obvious. how much is spent each year on the professional development of teachers in New South Wales, on giving them a chance to keep abreast of their field and new ideas on teaching methods, pedagogy, and so on? The answer was $25.60. $25.60 allocated. We recommended $600 for metropolitan teachers and $750 for rural or non-metropolitan teachers. And before we were finished, the two sides of politics were competing to outdo one another in that respect. Another thing we found related to, just let me quote this woman who was a teacher who was at the first meeting we had. We are asked to try and teach someone else's recipes that don't fit our particular students, our particular communities. There is a continual mismatch because we are trying to do something that our profession knows we can't do properly. Now, that came up time and time and time again. Another issue that came up time and again was related to child protection. In society, I believe, sometimes after a long period of denial of rights of a group, in this instance our young people and our children, the pendulum can swing so far as to be counterproductive from the point of view of the well-being of those kids. We found teachers who were walking on eggshells, who were terrified if two kids were having a fight, which I understand can happen, to separate them. That would leave them open to an accusation of child maltreatment. And the system was so set up that it had to be reported. At one school, a fantastic primary school, the principal told me with tears in her eyes that she had felt obliged to report a matter the day before where a little boy was using chopsticks with his lunch, and that's right, the teacher, making a hell of a racket, and the teacher came up and took them out of his hand and just tapped him on the arm. Don't do that. Report to the relevant section of the department, and so on. Now, this to me seemed crazy. And there are sometimes advantages in being an outsider. You come in and you think, what the hell's going on here? I'm pleased to say that the law has been modified, seriously modified, so that a teacher can now, believe it or not, say to a child, you're doing well. Fancy requiring a legislative change. Halfway through the inquiry, I was warned by several principals in jest that they were going to report me because I just found it natural. The kid come up and started talking, put your hand on its head. Violation. Pedagogy was the surprising thing, that you could go from one school and discover a rich amount of experimentation, teachers working together, and so on, and you go to the next country town and they'd be contemplating the possibility of doing something like that. There was no... the enthusiasm is at its height where you've got teachers collaborating, and it seems to be even better when you get them collaborating between schools and they show each other what they're doing. So we recommended a pedagogy clearinghouse where good ideas could be logged and where people could hear about it, and that's come to pass. And so it goes. Look, I think I'd better concentrate now just on a couple of things to do with the sort of lessons of it all. What happened here? As we went, one of the other things I should mention, because it's been so influential and so beneficial, and I can sleep at night, is that we recommended that for little kids in public schools, in the preschools, that there be no more than 20 in disadvantaged locations. There'd be no more than 20. And I won't go back over all that imagery, but I've just thought of more, like a little boy who was trying to tell me something and keep beating himself up because he couldn't get it out. But anyway, we also said that in year 1 there should be no more than 22, and we said in year 2 no more than mid-20s, I think it was 24. That has come to pass, and the bill for that is very, very substantial. But I'm sure it had as much to do with the combining of the figures. Like I was so moved by what I was seeing that, pity help anyone, I'm probably beginning to bore you with this now, but any politician who was within ear's reach, I'd tell them about it and tell them how terrible it is that you know, what are we to do? Turn these little children, point them towards Long Bay and say, well, look, we'll save a bit of time here. You're going to jail, kid. That's how I felt about it. And my own reaction was important, as will be your reaction to some of the things that you uncover, because it just adds something to the numbers. The numbers are important, but what the implications are, the human implications, is more so. Now, the next thing I was concerned about, there's wonderful things here, but we haven't got time to go over them all. So I'll just stay with the sort of lessons. The notion of a plan and priorities. I was believing, from all I'd seen before, that yes, I mean, insofar as Mr. Brogden was giving me time, Mr. Carr was giving me time and showing great interest, but still trying to pull a few Swifties here and there. I'll mention one Swiftie. The Swiftie was, Tony, you've calculated the cost spent per student in each state of Australia and New South Wales, and it turns out that New South Wales spends less than the other states. And you think that's a telling point, don't you? And I said, yes, it is. There's scope for a bit of expansion here. And if you brought it up to what the other states are doing, you'd go a long way towards meeting many of the bills that we're generating. But according to the principles of accrual accounting, which these other people in Canberra haven't taken sufficiently into account, we're using very expensive premises and so on. And they were very polite about it, but the Treasury officials got onto me and said, you know, this isn't being done in the right way. And then when you pause, you think, well, economics can't be all that different from logic. Surely what matters is not how valuable the building is, but how much has been spent on the teaching service and on the child. And I think Mr. Carr agreed to disagree on that matter, but I think I won. Anyway, so what I was terrified of was they'd say a couple of these things are good and we'll do them, and they were already showing goodwill that way. So it seemed important to develop a plan, not just something for today or this year or for the next election, although the election was looming and that's a very important consideration. But we developed something which, anyway, take my word for it, was a plan over 10 years for each of the things we were recommending. We said, we know all this can't be fixed up in 1 year or 2 years. Here is a plan. You've got to work towards this, achieving this plan. And also, here are our leading priorities. They were increased professional development funds and formation of professional development committees in schools, creation of a pedagogy clearinghouse, because we reckon a lot of the discipline problems weren't related to even to the family backgrounds and homes of the kids or the kids' inherent behavioural tendencies, but the sheer boredom for them of sitting through a lot of classes that weren't that engaging. And we saw schools where that was not the case. It was brilliantly done. Increased specialist support for teachers with integration students. The government deserved absolute commendation. In the 5 years up to 2002, they increased expenditure on integrating kids with some disabilities 200%. So they deserved commendation and they got it. But what we were saying was increase the specialist support for the teachers there. The small class sizes, we lost out completely on reintegrating the Board of Studies with the department. We didn't succeed there. Educational opportunity grant for country schools to level the playing field a bit so they could go to the cultural reservoirs and so on, repositories I should say. Support and so on. The important thing is there was a list of priorities. There was a plan. Now, the reference to the 2003 election, what am I doing here? The reference to the election was that more astute politicians than I, namely the Teachers Federation, had worked it all out. If this thing finished around about the end of 2002 and there was an election in March 2003, that'd be good timing. So rallies, school community visits, more dialogue with parliamentarians and so on. All this continued. But the two other things on this list that I just want to briefly mention, we said, well, we've got to belabour some of the social benefits of doing all this. Not just education per se, but the social benefits. So we presented research evidence on, for example, the fact that the number of completed years of formal schooling is a more important predictor of health than occupation or income. From the point of view of reducing social outlays, education decreases infant mortality, the age-specific rates of morbidity, disability and mortality. Education is associated with children's nutritional intake, and in adults, exercise, moderate drinking, weight control and so on. We listed all these things to say, as you do this, as you follow these recommendations, you'll be taking strides in that direction. Now, we added a bit here and said that when the projected state prison population of 10,000 is realised within the next 3 years, for approximately every 6 students completing the HSC in New South Wales, there will be 1 person in jail. The cost of imprisoning that single individual, around, well, at that time we said 60,000, a lot more now, would cover the cost of educating 7 to 8 senior high school students each year. It would also cover the cost of hiring an additional teacher. And then, in the final lesson to be drawn, we listed, for the benefit of the bean counters, potential savings. Now, I don't think too much notice was taken of this, but it was vital that it be there, I reckon, that to emphasise our practicality, that here are some ways in which you could recoup some of the extra expense that you're now facing by making some modifications. How many of you know, for example, that that 25% of the money spent on each public school student, 25% flows on to the non-government sector? Very few people know that. So if you increase the amount of money for public school students, you inevitably increase the amount of money available to the non-public system. So we made recommendations in that respect. We talked about some very technical things, but one that wasn't so technical was pegging the on-flow at 20%, as it had been a few years earlier. And we reckoned that would produce savings of the order of 50 to 75 million per annum. At the time of this report, the school bus service cost New South Wales $427 million per annum, and the average beneficiary received assistance to the tune of $630, or was it $830, a large sum anyway, per annum. We recommended some changes which would have had the effect of a little more walking in the metropolitan areas if you're close to school, but if you're, say, 3 or more kilometres away, the bus service could be used up to a maximum of about 5 or 6 or the nearest available school. And for country students who currently travel, in some instances, you know, several hours to get to school, we recommended up to 20 kilometres, unless there wasn't a school within that radius. And we also said that both metropolitan and rural parents should be able to be not to be so inhibited if they were in receipt of a national health card. You know, in other words, taking into account the socio-economic circumstances of the family, and various other measures. The one I want to finish on is this. Every year, you know, there's a start-up allowance to go back to school. What is it, $50? Still $50. And I was arguing with the Treasurer of New South Wales, Mr. Egan, at the time, that we should again invoke a socio-economic consideration, namely the health card availability, and that would save another approximately $30 million a year. The Treasurer jumped up in the following fashion from his desk: "What? Not while I'm the bloody Treasurer of New South Wales. That was my idea." So we backed off. Okay, good, there we are.
Okay, so the... So before we get to questions, just a couple of points. To give everyone an opportunity for questions, we'll just push the tutorials away for another half hour or so, which will allow us to engage with some of the themes and ideas that Tony has mentioned, and I think there are many. And before we specifically get to questions, I think there's one thing that emerges, I think, from what Tony had to say, and that is that all of what he had to say was based on an unstated assumption, which I think has acute resonance for University of Wollongong undergraduates, in fact all graduates, and that is a fundamental question. What is it that you are going to do with your degree when you graduate? Now clearly the university wants all graduates to go and have prosperous, successful lives, get jobs and live happily ever after. But I think embedded in that is also a social, moral and ethical consideration to be had. And I think what we heard today was that your education, your life, the things that you look at, the things that you do with your life, indeed are premised or can be premised on a social, moral and ethical, if not political consideration. I think what we heard today was a brilliant exposition of how those things separately and in combination can be used to bring about great change. And I think ultimately, if we go back to some of those things we mentioned in the first lecture, ultimately I think that is one of the principal purposes of an education. It's not just to graduate and get the comfortable life with the comfortable house and the 2 cars and all that. Yes, it can be about that, but it needn't just be about that. And I think we've heard today, and we've heard in every other presentation, that all the indicators in many ways are going the wrong way, and it requires a society, as Elisa said earlier, to be self-educated in bringing ourselves up to speed, but also for those who are formally educated, who have got the benefits of having a tertiary education, to do something powerful with that, and that's what we've heard today. So, I think off to questions. So we might, as usual, no mobile phones, no live stories, but if we could start with the most furthest outpost, Bega, then work our way up to this forum, we'll do it. So Bega, go ahead. And Tony, you can screen those.
We haven't got any questions at this stage, thanks, Tony.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Patrick. Bateman's Bay, Karen?
Hi Glenn, thanks Tony. Could we just have the screen put back to the full view there so we can see you up close and personal? Do we have any questions here? And here we have one question.
No, I have to do this. Sorry.
That's okay.
So far the questions are easy.
Not to worry, but look, yeah, that's it. We've got it. And yeah, we have a question in the microphone. You said that one of the issues in your research was that teachers feel they can't exercise professional discretion because they're controlled from central authority. Isn't what is suggested by the Labour government exactly that forcing these so-called league tables to be published will in fact undermine any professional discretion that teachers have over what they teach, how they teach, and what happens in their schools?
I think the position of those who are opposing the league tables is that you can't judge the quality of the teaching or the performance of the school without acknowledging a couple of things. First of all, the nature of the instruments being used, which are meant to be of a diagnostic category. But secondly, and this came out time and time again in the course of the inquiry that I was involved in, you know, the achievement level is as much determined, if not more determined, by the socioeconomic background of the students as of the performance of even the best teachers. There's a lot of research that shows that, you know, that particular factor, the socioeconomic background of the family, the amount of reading that takes place in the early stages of life, the interest shown, the examples shown by parents themselves reading and taking particular sorts of interests that are compatible with schooling or encouraging of schooling, all of that plays a very big part. And what they're saying is it would be very discouraging to the students, very discouraging to everyone concerned with the school to see shortcomings being implicitly attributed to the work being done rather than the reality of the influence of the social background of the students. Does that translate? That's what they're worried about. But look, on that matter of discretion, having watched the teachers closely, it's more like a struggle that's going on, or was going on at the time, to try and dictate via endless quantums of instructions and evaluations within given formats of what had happened today. It kind of absorbed the energy and creativity of the teachers, so they would say, yes, if we're going to have standard tests at regular intervals, that can impact on the exercise of our discretion too, because some teachers will finish up admitting to you that rather than see the school publicly drawn down by the results, they spend a lot of time coaching the kids in how to handle the standard tests.
So Karen, are there any other questions from Maples Bay?
Yes, I'll come back on that. You got to the stage of talking about the importance of social and home features which help a child in education. That's where we lost you. I wondered if would you mind summarising what else you said in your answer? Thank you. You were answering questions.
Oh, well, how about if I say it very briefly?
Thank you.
Okay, what the teachers are saying is that comparisons between schools based on achievements of youngsters on standard tests which emanate from the Commonwealth tell you more about the socio-economic backgrounds from which they come than the actual skill of the teachers engaged in those schools. Now, I didn't say this the first time, but let me go to the other extreme. If you go to some of the most sought-after schools in New South Wales, where they regularly get a large number of people in the highest possible HSC results, as I have, I've been and looked at these schools, then all the teachers really have to do is open the gates in the morning. The kids come pouring through with their parents on their heels, I noticed. And when we had a forum that I thought was for us to talk with the students, the parents were there. In other words, people who are enthusiastic about education have had the benefits of it themselves, impart those benefits by reading to the kids, encouraging their participation in schooling and so on. That's a tremendous advantage. Now, to cap it all off, there have been some overseas studies which have shown that children from such backgrounds where the parents are well educated, enthusiastic about education, the kids actually go ahead more rapidly during long holidays than during the school year.
In other words, league tables may have the direct opposite effect that the government's seeking to deliver to an eager public. So rather than just listing all public schools, I think there are 9,000 public schools in Australia, listing all public schools 1 to 9,000, rather than saying that X is at the top and Y is at the bottom, what it could do is either A, reinforce the social disadvantage that schools 8,000 and 9,000 find themselves in, or worse, finding some schools who embark upon a process of coaching their students to do with the test in order to move them up the league table, which is the opposite of what a broader primary education could or should be about. I think.
That's good.
I'm no longer a member of the Teachers Federation, so I don't know. So, Joel Hayden, I'm wondering, are there any questions from you? Don't rush.
Very good.
Take it up.
I pressed the wrong button.
All right.
Yes, you mentioned initially when you started about judicial accountability. Can you please explain?
This is really a kind of folly that one gets into by listening to John Hatton. I didn't say anything in the speech because there's still a defamation action running now. I think it's running. It's probably there must be some statute of limit. Is our lawyer still here? Some statute of limitations. I should find out anyway. But John told me on one occasion that what was really needed in New South Wales was something he called a Crims Who. Not a who's who, but a Crims Who. Pardon? Hood's Who, I'm sorry, yes. And I'll simply confine my remarks to saying that one or two remarkable patterns of outcomes were at least inviting of explanation when you looked at, you matched up offences, you matched up everything you possibly could, and then had involved particular solicitors and particular judges. It wasn't widespread, but it was promoted as a way of monitoring the operations of the courts in order to identify what we'd ordinarily call outlier decisions that could then be followed up in other ways and see if there was a justification for it. Do you think that's fair? That's a fair way of putting it, isn't it? Now, John hasn't got this defamation action against him, so he'll probably say
that Tony's research pointed out blips in the statistics which would only be in the way that certain drug cases in particular were handled as against the general statistical background, which would point in a certain direction as regards the officers' involvement in that case, the judicial officers involved in the case. Out of that came a storm with the judges in the Superman outfits parading in front of Parliament House. That's the first time I think that's ever happened, except on the official opening day, and quite a lot of flack. The Attorney General wishing urgently to speak with Tony Vinson, and out of that came the Judicial Commission. Now, I suggested to Nathan today, as we bring the law here, as a good exercise for his students, to look at the origins of the Judicial Commission and its effectiveness.
Of course, if you wanted a Crims or a Hood's Who's Who, with some creative reading of the current Who's Who, the beginnings of the supplementary volume, the Hood's Who's Who, has already begun for you, without mentioning any names. I could, but all right. So I'm wondering, are there any other questions from Joel Hayden before we move to the hearings?
Mr. Vinson, I was interested in your comment about pointing kids to Long Bay and saying, off you go, that's your direction. And I noticed on your list of disadvantaged areas that you had Curry, the Cessnock area. Mm-hmm. So that's one place that has a prison and disadvantaged kids. Shoalhaven is also fairly close to the bottom of the list, and we did a prison. I wondered what you thought about prisons going to disadvantaged areas and what impact that had on the community.
Well, no, I think even more quickly you can stop me. No, look, there is one iron rule of penology, and it is build a prison and you'll fill it. To personalise it a little bit here, I mean, I was appointed to be the head of the prisons, not to expand the industry, but when I went there, and I was there for 3 years, there were just under 4,000 people in prison. And when I'd finished 3 years later, and they hadn't all escaped, as some uncharitable person said, the figure was 3,200. The task of the state is to use prisons very, very sparingly. I find something revolting, really, about locating the prisons in the most disadvantaged areas, ostensibly for the convenience of visitors, but it just makes it so much easier to use an imprisonment form of sentence, a custodial sentence, in those circumstances. The best example was the ACT, which for a long time did not have a prison that could accept maximum security prisoners. And it had possibly the lowest rate of imprisonment in the world, about 20 per 1,000 population of the relevant age group. Now they've got a great big new shiny prison. I think the prison population is going up. So if you put one in, the one in Cessnock was there a long time ago, well, quite a while ago. But the more, I think I'll simply say, the more you locate the prisons at a convenient distance, the more they will be resorted to as a form of sentence.
Which can be summarised by build it and they will come.
And what about intercepting the lives? There being no better single remedy for this problem than making sure all kids get a very good start in their schooling.
All right, and so to the Highlands, where there is no prison. Penny, I'm wondering, do you have any questions?
Yes, you talk about the disadvantaged areas, and unfortunately a lot of them have a higher population of Indigenous communities.
That's right.
How did you find, was this addressed specifically in your report, and did the experience of the teachers in those schools have any indication of what was going on? Like, were there any recommendations
about schools with significant numbers of Aboriginal students?
Yes.
Okay, I can say yes. Well, if not from the teachers, at least from the people in the inquiry. We found some schools which were led by principals who were extremely interested in Aboriginal culture, Aboriginal ways of explaining things, and they identified very strongly with the families, the Aboriginal families. That was the positive picture. We found some schools where a person could become, or did become, the principal of a school with a significant Aboriginal population and who did not have that interest. So we recommended that this be a type of appointment outside of the usual promotional system. And I must say the sponsors supported us in that we needed a special kind of person with particular interests to be in charge of I'll call it an Aboriginal school, but I mean a significant proportion of Aboriginal students. The second thing we recommended was that Aboriginal knowledge be included in the curriculum of that school. And this is, in a way, part of that flexibility that the teachers were looking for. Thirdly, that the Aboriginal staff assistants be taken seriously. There was a school on the Central Coast, I can't think of its name now, where the woman in that role did a fantastic job, and the principal would not dream of doing something in relation to an Aboriginal student or family without her involvement. But it wasn't always like that. Sometimes they were just a token presence in some schools. And finally, we believe that in order to cultivate the interest of prospective teachers in working in such a school, the universities should work with the department to identify students at the student stage who had a particular interest in these issues, and to and that a scheme be introduced to make sure that they did their prac work or placement in such a school. Okay?
Okay, Penny, I'm wondering, are there any other questions from Australia?
No, that's fine then. Yes.
Cool. So I'm wondering, are there questions from Wollongong?
Question I had about building business, building all business. The populist press is very prone to localising how legal law enforcement, what's spending more money on punishment and so on and so forth. Governments need to pick up on that particular direction, John. What would the shop shops have to say about the schools report?
Well, that's a very interesting question. They were quite supportive. No more so than Mr. Alan Jones, who was terrifically supportive. I think it was his own, he worked as a teacher at one stage in a non-government school, but he could not have been more encouraging. So that's the truth of the matter. But if I can recall a conversation I had with the then Premier, he was talking about what he called an upsurge or demand from the community for more severe punishment of offenders. And I should have controlled my tongue, but I said largely the chorus is led by your own conducting. You're the one who's inviting that sort of reaction. I tell you that you will never spend $1 more soundly on crime prevention than on getting kids settled into school and staying in school. Here's the statistic I'm fond of quoting. The rate, and it probably finishes the last question too, the rate of trouble, being in trouble with juvenile justice in New South Wales of Aboriginal kids of Aboriginal background is very high. And indeed, if you look at the prisons, the adult prisons today, you'll find that 2% of the population or thereabouts contributes 22% of the male prisoners. In the women's prison, about 2% will contribute 30% plus. A disgraceful state of affairs, and not one to be remedied by putting more in. But anyway, if you look at Aboriginal kids who have completed high school, their rate of incarceration, their rate of trouble with juvenile justice is identical with the community at large. See the difference? And it's 13 times less than their kindred who have not had the benefit of going right through school.
Okay, question up to that. I'll repeat it for you.
It's great to have you on Wollongong for 20 years, and thank you for coming down to the university. I was wondering what your thoughts are on the disadvantage of visiting in Illawarra, and particularly Wollongong, those areas, and down in Shoalhaven now. What your thoughts are on how we could go about building some sort of social work faculty here in Wollongong.
Okay, so the question is about what does Tony Vinson think about social disadvantage in the Illawarra and the Shoalhaven, what might be done about that, and what could be done to get a social work department at the University of Wollongong.
Where's my friend?
Here's a very good point about the social work degree.
Yes, a colleague from Centrelink is saying it would be a very good idea to have a social work degree here. Well, I think there's every reason why there should be one, because there are sufficient unique features of this region, the South Coast, to warrant particular attention. I mean, you could say, well, just as I came this way on the train today, why can't they go up and do the social work course at several of the places in Sydney? But it would be really good. And I noticed the ACT has a social work degree through the Catholic University. It would be a very, very good grounding for social work students to be educated in this region. Now, as to the evidence, there is evidence of those pockets of disadvantage, not numerous, but there, that could be the subject of particular attention. The best form of education for social work I've ever seen was in the west of Sweden, where I spent some time in the University of Gothenburg, or Göteborg, where the students spent their first year in a housing estate. They had their classes and they had their lectures and so on, and the teachers had to be very flexible. Talk about flexibility. By the end of the year, the students would have got through a curriculum, but whatever happened on the estate that day was the starting point for learning. I taught in a medical course at Newcastle University, and it had the same sort of, something like the same approach, that you start with a problem and you try and work out what would you do if you had the responsibility for trying to improve that situation. So there is scope for a really quite, by conventional standards, quite a radical, different sort of social work course here. In education, my understanding is that education students can have a similar kind of arrangement in some of the schools. So already this university has pioneered that sort of, problem-based learning, really, and in situ. That's the sort of social work school I think would be great here. Not huge, not large, not necessarily receiving students from Sydney, but based here and using the local situation as the basis for the education. Perhaps that's enough.
Yeah, and on top of that...
And when do I apply for the job?
How much you're emeritus?
Oh, some time ago.
Wollongong could be a social laboratory for this, and I think it's true to say that there have been few, if any, major studies of social problems on public housing estates. In Wollongong, we have several public housing estates, and from someone who grew up on one, who lived next door to a serial bank robber. There was a drug dealer up the road, around the corner, whose house I had to pass on the way to the shop. Was eventually a person convicted for 2 life sentences for murder, a rapist around the corner, known drug dealer, etc., etc., etc. And I've often thought that, A, how do I get out of there alive? And B, why isn't there more? Why even have I looked at something of my background? I think the social work department, which Tony will now head up, we'll address that. Okay, other questions?
I just wanted to add to that. I know personally the high level of disadvantage in South Coast County. I know personally the high level of unemployment, the high level of single-parent families, the problems within many schools. When you think of the 3 satellite campuses, the establishment here of a school of social work would be extraordinarily important to cover the South Coast and Southern Highlands. And when you think how isolated the far South Coast is from this sort of access, then I think this is the place to have it, if not further south.
Okay, can I just add, and John will bear me out in this, at least part of it, that UNSW has had a unit on the Waterloo housing estate now, supported by government, by the housing department, and supported by the university for more than 10 years, involving architecture students, social work students, the lot. You could do the same thing here.
I actually worked for and the local trades have been working with us for the past
Oh, that's great.
A comment from someone in the audience here for other centres is that someone works at the Wollongong Community Centre, and she's saying that TAFE has students doing civic welfare course have been going through there for some time. What I can say is that on my way back to Sydney tonight, before he deals with those phone calls that he will be receiving from you until midnight, he'll be working on the opening section of the second Vinson report, which will be looking at social disadvantage in Illawarra, with you establishing the faculty of social work. So other questions from Wollongong? Yes.
Do you think that it could be cause for government inaction? I'm thinking of Wollongong this day because we have very busy couple of days out there. Yeah. And we've had to fight very hard to get Centrelink brought to Wollongong, Medicare brought to Wollongong, and we fought very hard to save our hospital. And that has gone through all government action that was done in Wollongong.
Yes, well, I think, okay, inaction. No, they haven't, so many of the estates and that were developed without thinking ahead to the ordinary needs of people. And also, and again, I'm on dangerous ground, but I'll say it, if an organisation like Centrelink were to make a particular project of Wollongong, it would be working with the style of work would be collaborate with the other agencies, the other organisations, and draw attention to these absences of service and make sure that the full range of things that are needed, the people themselves say we want and we need, that would be assisted in that way. Let's hope they do it.
We had quite a battle to bring
Yeah, I'm sure you, yeah.
And also...
It's under new management. I say it's under new management, we hope.
Professor Vinson, thank you. And I've just followed along, it's just probably a cumulative thought with Ollie's comment. I just think with the new social inclusion policy of the federal government, and also with its building a strong, vibrant, resilient communities, there may be an opportunity to actually, as a federal company, establish that course in Wollongong with the focus of doing research and making these socially disadvantaged communities stronger.
Yes, there would be a possibility of that, particularly since the same minister is the Minister for Education and the Minister for Social Inclusion.
So I think politically,
yeah, it's not a bad thought. Yeah.
Okay, I think we might have time for just two more questions. So, first one.
You taught me many years ago.
Yes, I've got to say hello.
People do, in practical sense. Take, for example, my grandchildren live in a housing commission estate, not very far away from Tees, which is our best resource school in the area. The school they go to, very close by, can't even get an excursion up because the parents are either from the refugees or out of housing commission estates. And I get stuck in the traffic behind the bus that belongs to Tees. We've got money for the hall, can't get built yet because of asbestos on the ground. I think Tees looks like it's going to be running 3 stories. What can we do?
Yes, well, I suppose that this is what the alliance that's in battle formation this week is partly on about, that they're saying, and there's truth to it, that the Commonwealth funding, one third of students in Australia are non-government schools, 2/3 are at government schools. The Commonwealth funding goes in the reverse proportions. 2/3 goes to the non-government schools. So I mean, that's a political battle being fought on a very big scale. I mean, you'd have to get behind that if you felt the way you do. It is. But even at the state level, now this is going to sound, this will have me up before some tribunal when I say this, unless I'm careful. But when I was on that inquiry, I went to Milton Public School and was horrified. The classrooms had mould on the walls, there were leaks, there were broken steps. The whole setup looked quite dangerous for little kids. The place was overcrowded. It was in a very, very poor condition. So I broke the general rule of trying to talk about the system generally and went and saw the minister at the time and said, look, you've got to do something about that school. You've got to. It's in a terrible state. Now, has anybody seen Milton High School lately? It's terrific, isn't it? They've got beautiful new buildings. Now, I've got to be very, very careful with the chronology here. My granddaughter had not been born at that time. She is now a student at Milton School. She was and her parents were living in Sydney. I had no idea. But so the squeaky wheel gets the oil there.
We're hoping Tony is not going to be incarcerated, but I'm sure that if he is, we A, will visit, and B, he will continue to work on the second Vinson report. So one question from me, and then one question. I think everyone likes to comment.
In the scheme of things where you get a socially disadvantaged area where children have very little education,
Yes.
social life skill, is there any plans or opportunities for parents to be educated simply outside the system?
Yes.
Okay, so the question is, in socially disadvantaged areas, what plans, if any, might exist for parents to be educated to break the cycle of social disadvantage?
Yeah. I'm delighted to say that as a result of a lot of people, a very small contribution has come from things I've been associated with, but there's been widespread interest in getting kids off to a good start from many sources. So it's, I'm not being arrogant about it. But what will happen this year, 2011, I think, is the beginning of a rollout of free preschool education, 15 hours a week, for all 4-year-old children in Australia. Now you might think that's terrific, and it is terrific because we've talked about it for so long, but you go to Sweden, England, all these other countries, they've got that already. They've got that, it's passé. But this is a start, and I've certainly been lobbying for, in the most disadvantaged areas, for this to start at 3 years of age. The opportunity, you can't force it, but the opportunity be there. Now, many of the schools that will be the recipients of Commonwealth money in the next couple of years will be establishing on their grounds a sort of one-shop approach to health and social, personal issues concerning young children. And the intention is to try and get as many of the parents interested in the education as possible. In some schools of my acquaintance, it's done brilliantly. For example, it's at Johns Park in Western Sydney. The very clever principal has made sure that 3 staff members their first language is Cantonese and the other languages that are spoken by a majority of the parents. And every fortnight, I think it is, periodically, they all come up to the school, they bring some food, they have a long talk. The teachers inject information about what's going on in the classroom. That's the sort of thing we need to involve the parents. It's easier said than done because a lot of parents who are disinterested have only the worst memories of school themselves and hate going near the places. So there has to also be some outreach. The schools have to develop the ability, the willingness to go out and make home visits, invite the parents in personally, get them involved that way. And I know of projects in Australia, particularly one in Queensland, where that's been done with great success. And the parents begin to believe this school is for us. It's part of our effort to help our children, which is the relationship you want.
Right, one just a statement. I did an associate diploma in social science in 94-95 at Wollongong too. There was quite a few students there, so I'm sure there's many doctor workers that are right on the front line and doing a marvellous job. And second, my question is, what's the criteria for receiving legal aid?
The question is, what is the criteria for receiving legal aid?
Well, I haven't kept abreast of it, but we were told today, weren't we? I think it's means tested still, and also there's the credibility and winnability of the case. That's my understanding. These have long been the criteria, I think, that the person is without the means of being legally defended, and also that this is not an exercise that's doomed before it starts. Yeah, a winnable thing.